This comes up a lot when I talk about how the word obese is a slur. At least one person will always pop their head out of the ground to say, obese is a medical term, as if that somehow makes it better.
Yo-yo and hello, my name is Lydia, and on today's episode of my 25-pound yo-yo, we will be continuing on our discussion about the word obese and if it's garbage. Last week, we ventured into the definition of obese, which is to eat oneself fat. And this was a reason why many fat activists hate that word and they think it's a slur. Well, today we're going to continue on that discussion in terms of the medicalization of the word obese, and is there some meaning behind it that is more advantageous than simply using the word fat? Last week we used a Hannah TikTok, and this week we're once again using Hannah. So let's see what she has to say about the medicalization of the word obese.
I can always identify someone who doesn't have a great grasp on history if they see medicalization as a stamp of inherent virtue. This comes up a lot when I talk about how the word obese is a slur. At least one person will always pop their head out of the ground to say, obese is a medical term, as if that somehow makes it better. You know what else used to be a medical term? Like a lot of bad shit we don't say anymore, because we realized it was stigmatizing as fuck and it actively harmed people. You can Google them, I'm not going to say them here. Science and language are both constantly evolving and updating. The medical establishment is not exempt from this. If anything, it's actually a particularly strong example of how this happens. We don't need to look too far back into history at all to see how medical terminology and practices change. For example, homosexuality is no longer diagnosed as a mental illness. Female hysteria is not something that's diagnosed anymore. Cocaine and heroin are no longer prescribed as anesthetics or cough suppressants. Lysol cleaning spray is no longer used as a douche. We don't perform ice pick lobotomies anymore. And doctors no longer advocate for the health benefits of smoking cigarettes. Oops. More importantly, when a marginalized group tells you that a word or practice harms them, you can just go ahead and believe them.
So I know Hannah didn't say it in this particular TikTok, but she prefers the word fat.
Please just use the word fat. It's a morally neutral descriptor.
And I think that there's too many differences between the words obese and fat to simply make that exchange. So why don't we watch this next clip about the words obese versus fat, then come back and discuss.
Obese versus fat. Fat is the word for the white or yellowish substance found in adipose tissue. Obese is the medical word for having an abundance of fat. This abundance is above what medical practitioners would deem overweight. All people have fat. Some people have more fat than others, but you need a certain amount of fat to be obese. Obesity is quantified by BMI, waist circumference, or body fat percentage, whereas fat is visually perceived without any measurement. Fat and obese are different in the medical field because one means having a large amount of fat and the other means having eaten oneself fat. For example, the blue whale is the fattest mammal, but it's not obese. That is just how whales are. However, a rat that was overfed in a science experiment is obese, not fat. People that have fat-related diseases are treated differently too. For example, the prescription is different for those that have both obesity and lipedema. Both are fat, but obesity can be cured with diet and exercise and, if needed, medication, whereas lipedema, well, it requires surgery. Medical words have meaning to them, and the word fat simply does not give as much information as obese.
So as we can see from the clip, the word fat and obese are not exact synonyms, now are they? You see, fat is a noun predominantly, and colloquially we use it as a descriptor as an abundance of fat. But obese has more meaning to it. It not only has a specified criteria for getting diagnosed as obese, but it also is linked to medical conditions and describes how a person acquired the condition, which is an overconsumption of calories. So we can see that the word obese has far more meaning than the word fat. The categorizations are important because a doctor could evaluate someone who is obese class 1 as having more risk of heart disease than someone that is overweight, but less risk than someone who is of obese class 2. The measurements and classifications make a difference to doctors. We also can't just replace the classes of obesity with the categories because the categories are created around social issues. So if you are a super fat in one city, you could be a mid fat in another city due to the availability of a Lane Bryant that's walking distance to you. And unfortunately, these details matter very little in medicine. Labeling a patient with obesity also makes a difference when diagnosing a fat disease because obesity is treated differently than other fat diseases such as lipedema. If you're diagnosed with obesity, you can lose the weight with diet and exercise and maybe some medication. But lipedema is resistant to all of that and only surgery works. Changing medical terminology is a process, and when the change that Hannah spoke of took place, the publication released on the web showed that the change was due to stigma, but also the accuracy of the word. And when you look at all the comments, yes, stigma was a major part of it, but there were also a lot of concerns about the word itself and its meaning. So in order to change a word, it's not just the stigma. It is about what does the word mean and what will the new word that replaced it mean as well. There was also documentation about, well, if we change the word here, we have to make sure that these definitions are also updated. And the same process would need to be made if they were to indeed change the word obese. But the difference here is that the word obese still has a valid meaning, whereas the R word was actually kind of invalid in a lot of situations. Furthermore, I think that the R word as a slur is more indicative of the time and society where we had low tolerance for any difference than the actual word itself. Do you not think that at the time, if we called it intellectual disability, we would have made up a slur back then? I think we would have. So yes, for that one, I completely agree with changing the terminology just because there is so much stigma around that word. And I think that would be said across the board, anyone that has been labeled that way. But obese? I'm not so sure. I think that there's a split, and it's probably more in favor of people preferring obese versus fat, but I can't be sure on that. And when we speak about obesity, if we were to change the word, we couldn't just use fat. We would need something more descriptive, something that we could measure, something that would indicate risk. All these things that fat activists hate. So whatever word they came up with, whatever word defined eating oneself fat or fat by this measurement, it would also be considered a slur. And all those examples that Hannah threw out at the end as a comparison, well, to me, they were just silly. They were examples of progress. We also use utensils and don't eat with our hands now, Hannah. I mean, it's just silly. These are things that we have learned from. We learned how to do new things. We learned new inventions. We learned technology. And if she wants to compare these silly things, where is the scientific evidence that we were doing something wrong in the first place? Because we have learned that Lysol is harmful to our skin. We have developed technologies that aid us in doing brain surgeries. We have learned that smoking causes lung cancer. What precisely have we learned from fat acceptance? Have we learned that obesity is not harmful to our health? Have we learned that the word obese is not accurate in its description? I wholeheartedly agree that we should not be using slurs to bully fat people, but I do not see how using the word obese as a medical condition fits in that category or is inaccurate or wrong in any way. I feel like we've really gotten off track here because this video was supposed to be about the word obese and not obesity, but Hannah threw out these silly examples, so here we are. But if we get back to the word obese itself, sure, it can be delivered as an insult, but so can fat or any other word that we replace it with. I think that the real reason why fat activists are against the word obese is because it's tied to science. You see, if you call someone fat, you're the one with the problem. But if you call them obese, they're the one with the problem. Fat is a descriptor. Obese is a consequence. And we all know that consequences are not something that fat activists deal well with. So, changing our language is exactly what fat activists want us to do so that they can absolve themselves of any responsibility. Because if you call someone obese, that means they did that to themselves. Versus fat, well, they just are fat. But alas, this is my 25-pound yo-yo, and not the word obese is still garbage in the medical field too. So, until next time, yo-yo and let's go.